This is the next book we're publishing by Mizuki, and this is a book that will be out in a couple months. It's going to the printer next week, in fact. And this is probably his best-known work in Japan. It's Mizuki actually believes in fables, and not in fables, in ghosts. In Japan, they call them yokai. And so this is a book about him and his grandmother, and about all the yokai, or ghosts, or spirits that they believe in. And this book, when it was published in French a few years ago, it won the Angoulême Prize, which is the comics festival in France, for best book. Now this is getting back to where we're based in Canada. Another book that we've published lately in recent years has been a book by this cartoonist Doug Wright. He died in 1983, but he worked for newspapers in the 1950s and 60s. So this is something that we've also been doing, is that we've been taking. We're looking at the older work of cartoonists like Tove Jansson from Finland or Doug Wright in Canada, and we found that in some cases that work was actually overlooked or forgotten. So in this case, we're bringing the work back, and beautiful work, and it's something that should continue to be out there. And we've also sort of branched out. I mean, our primary focus is graphic novels, but we've had an art book imprint called Petit Livre, and it focuses primarily on non-narrative art books. So this one came out a year and a half ago, Native Trees of Canada by Leanne Shapton. And what she did is she actually found this book. There actually is a book called Native Treaties of Canada with black and white photographs. It originally was published in 1917. And she did all these paintings inspired by these photographs. This is a book by cartoonist Daniel Clowes, like Chris Ware and Chester Brown and Seth, among others. He's probably one of the most important cartoonists of the last 30 years or so. This is probably as close as we'd get to publishing a superhero comic. It more or less is a superhero comic. It's sort of a take on superheroes and 9/11. This is a book that was just published a few months ago. This was the first time we've published a book by what's called a web cartoonist, Kate Beaton from Canada. She was living in New York for a couple years. She started serializing her comics online. She has this website called Hark a Vagrant, the same title as the book, and she actually developed this readership, where at this point, 500,000 people a month are going onto her website. So this was her first book that came out collecting her work. She does comics on literature and history, and yet seemingly those would not be popular subject matters, and yet she's developed this enormous following. Another recent book that we published, Adventures of Hergé. It was originally serialized in our anthology, Drawn and Quarterly, but just published a few months ago as its own book. This was first, of course, written in French and translated into English. A fairly new cartoonist we published is Brecht Evans from Belgium. He's from the Flemish side of Belgium. And again, I think it's a good example because he shows what you can do with graphic novels. His artistic approach is very, very inventive. He's real genius over here. And he's a young guy. I don't think he's even 25 yet. This fellow is from my city, Montreal, and Matt Forsyth. This is another approach to graphic novels. It's a wordless graphic novel. Actually, the entire book is actually told with very few words. It's almost wordless. And again, this is sort of a good example of sort of, if you want to take on a project and doing a book without words, and if you try it, it's probably very difficult to pull it off. Matt actually was just here in India a couple months ago. A book that just came out this week is Goliath by the British cartoonist Tom Gauld. Again, it's yet another example of what you can do with graphic novels. I mean, this is taking an old story, David and Goliath, and he just decided to turn it into a graphic novel. And yet, it's an old story, but it's the way he tells it. It's really, really funny. He's one of the great new cartoonists of the last 5 or 6 years. This is another book by Guy Delisle. This is the same guy who did Pyongyang, the journey to North Korea. This book will be out in English from John and Corley in a couple months. It was just published in France, and it won the Angoulême Prize last month for Best Graphic Album. And again, like the Pyongyang book, Jerusalem is a book about Guy's journey to Israel. He lived there for an entire year, and he wrote about his experiences. And also, one of the things we've been branching out with in the last few years are kids' books. It's kind of funny because it brings it full circle, because I started this off saying that how we're doing comics, trying to convince people that comics weren't just for kids and they could be for adults. But, now we're also doing comics that are for kids too. One of the things is that, I don't see many kids comics being done nowadays that I like very much. A lot of them are very generic and so on. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Drawn and Corley is to find good kids comics. In many cases, they're books, like older books that existed, and sort of republishing them, and trying to reintroduce comics for kids. And over here, Anne and Fraga was a French translation, and Pippi is Pippi Longstocking, which is sort of this famous character from Scandinavia. And I'm going to end the presentation with something else that we've branched off with in recent years. About 5 years ago, we opened up our own bookstore in the city where we're based in Montreal. And our focus, of course, is still publishing, but the bookstore actually ended up becoming very, very successful, which is a good sign, because you always hear so much doom and gloom about publishing, and in particular about bookstores. But I think that whenever you have something that's unique and it has its own voice, I think it can always succeed. I think a lot of bookstores that I find, at least, that don't succeed are the ones that are the sort of the more general ones that have sort of appeal to sort of everyone and no one at the same time. So it was sort of nice to see that it's it was well received. This is one of the openings that we've had. And then this is our mascot, Soft Boy, who's has his own comic book. Just one final note about our bookstore is that one of the best sellers at our bookstore was a book right here from India. About 5 years ago, I was at a comic symposium in England, and I met the publisher of Tara Books. And Tara Books is this wonderful publisher here in India. They, for the most part, don't do comics. They do art books. But they did this great silkscreen book called The Nightlife of Trees. And I think it was only limited to 1,000 copies. And so we started ordering it for the bookstore. It sold 5 copies and 10 copies. And finally, like now, it sold over 200 copies. So I think we've sold about 20% of the print run of this book that was printed in India. And I think that's about it. I think there might be a Q&A. But otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone, and in particular, all the organizers here at the India Comic Con. Thanks.
Take a seat, please. Yeah, so we did a pretty detailed interview with you for the Indian Comics Journal, which is available at the PCP stall. So I think for the audience, we'd like to go over some of those questions again, so just to get a more detailed answers. So what was your initial reaction just to have a periodical? Was your initial intention just to have a periodical, or was it a conscious effort to expand to publishing graphic novels?
Well, at the time when John and Corley started, I think the intentions were it was just to have a periodical itself, a magazine, and then one thing led to another. We started meeting cartoonists for this magazine, and then we started publishing their comic books, and so on. But that was still years before actual graphic novels were part of the mainstream.
All right. So DNQ has become an icon for indie and fringe comics. So how do you cope with being the Canadian indie comics messiah?
Well, it's the funny thing is that we are based in Canada, but our readership is I would say about 80% of our readership is in the United States. Part of that is because Canada has a very small population. There's only 30 million people. Which I think is almost the same as Delhi, right? Delhi is over 20 million. So Canada it's about the size of the landmass of India or China, but it has this really tiny spread out population. So we rely on the Americans to keep us afloat.
All right. So DNQ has boosted and supported the careers of many now renowned comics artists like Joe Matt, Guy Delisle, Daniel Close, Chris Ware, Joe Sacco, just to name a few. So which would you say has been your favorite or most treasured find?
Well, you can't really pick a single person because I think they're all so talented, and it's I wouldn't want to single any of them out.
All right. So DNQ is generally taken to be like really strongly linked to bohemian or hipster culture. So what are your views on that?
Again, I think I mentioned this in the interview that a lot of the readership tends to be younger. I mean, it could be 20s, to 30 or so on. But we actually do have a readership, well into the 30s, 40s, and even 50s. I mean, certainly people who started off reading it 25 years ago would be now, pushing 50. So, no, I think it's a pretty diverse readership.
All right. So would you say DNQ is an author's publisher or a reader's publisher?
Probably both. I mean, we certainly focus on the authors. I mean, as I was saying before, earlier, the author's voice is very, unique in each instance. And a reader's publisher, because readers, readers are drawn to this kind of material. I mean, people who are who are looking for something else that's different from your mainstream kind of books.
Is DNQ planning to expand to the digital media?
Well, a few months ago, we actually launched a couple of ebooks by Chester Brown. His book Louis Riel, and his most recent book Paying for It. But that's going to be slow, and my preference is the physical books. I certainly hope book publishing itself will always be around, and hopefully the two can coexist.
Are any film adaptations of your titles in the pipeline?
At the moment, there's always a number. There's always a number of different titles that are in adaptation. At the moment, probably the closest one to happening is a book by Daniel Klaus called Wilson. It's supposed to be directed by Alexander Payne, who just did the film called The Descendants by stars George Clooney.
Okay. All right. What are your views on comic conventions in general and the mainstream comic book industry?
Well, comic conventions, they all have their purpose. They serve their, they're all, I actually much prefer the smaller shows or the shows that are very different from your big mainstream conventions. I mean, like this one,
Okay. So, how are you liking your visit to India so far? Is this your first visit?
Yes, it's great. Yeah, it's a fascinating country. Yeah, I wish I was here longer.
Okay. And what do you think about the Indian Comic Con?
Like I said, it's great. It's fantastic that I like the idea of having it out in this outdoor market.
All right. All right. Thank you. I think I will take some questions from the audience now
Okay.
for you. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Chris. What would you say about, when we have big publishing houses like Marvel and DC who have an international presence, so do you really see, indie books becoming international, or at least maybe in India, because we don't have, this sort of stuff is only for people who really want to read it. They are the ones who can, who find and buy these books, but they're not easily available in India. So can you see, maybe in the near future, do you think it would reach a more international audience rather than just being North America?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I hope it's hard to tell what the market is like here. It's certainly the population is there. There's over 1 billion people, but so it really is hard to tell, like, how, because a lot of this stuff is new to people here. It's sort of harder to start off with something when it's not really known that well. Yeah. My hope is that there'll be cartoonists from India who'll be doing books like these. Many of the books that I was talking about here were from people from all over the world.
Right, yeah.
So it would be great. It would be great to see books. There are books from people in India, but like books that are published in North America by people from India, and in French editions of the book, English editions, and so on.
Nice. One more question. Which is your favorite superhero?
Sorry, what's that?
What's your favorite superhero?
I don't really have one, although when I was a kid, probably Superman or Batman, the usual.
Hi, my question to you will be, when autobiographical comics or memoir, the person who's creating a comics, how do you see how much distance he needs to create to something which is more universal, or it needs to be personal?
It really depends. I think it's a little bit of the two. I think it often is very personal by the nature of the material, but usually if it's, you could say if it's more successful, it's the themes are more universal. They're not just gazing at their belly buttons.
All right. Also, like when there's a non-fiction comic, say Joe Sacco, when he does all his Palestine and Sefer Goraz Day, if someone wants to do it, how do you accept the pitch for something like that? Or do you see earlier works and depending on that you go for it?
You mean when somebody is submitting their work?
Yeah.
Yeah, they usually send us, by email some samples, or they might have their own website, and we'll look at samples, and so usually if we like their work, we'll ask them if we can work with them.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, good evening. I'm a big fan of Tintin. I saw in your presentation there's one about the adventures of Hergé. So I want to know what exactly it is. Is it about the creator, Hergé, or is it something different?
It is. It's about the creator of Tintin, Hergé, and it's his life story. So it starts from about the time he's 7 years old up until his death. But it's not a long, but it's about 80 pages. But each period of his life is there's about 3 or 4 pages devoted to his life. But it's all told in comic book form, and the art it's sort of like an homage to Hergé's style. It almost looks like a Tintin book.
Any further questions? Anybody? Okay, I guess that'll be it. Thank you very
All right,
much.
thanks
Chris,
again.
for being here. It's an honor having you here at
All right,
our
it's an
event.
honor to be here.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.